Marco Rubio said this. We thought that China would become more like us, but we became more like China. Well, I would say you should become more like China. Objectively speaking, the standard of living in China is higher, especially in a lot of the tier 1 cities, the tier 2 cities. If you look at all the data, the Human Development Index is getting better, per capita income is getting better in China, whereas it's not in the US. The entire 21st century will entirely revolve around China. The role of China in the global economy is the biggest economy. When you adjust for purchasing power, China has been larger than the US economy for a decade now, and every year it's growing. Right. So if you look at a chart of China's share of the global economy over time and the US share, they're going in opposite directions. China is becoming more important. China is about 20% of the global economy now and growing. The US is now less than 15% and falling.
This is Ben Norton. He's a journalist known for his incredible insights into the global geopolitical landscape and how it ties directly into economics. Ben currently lives in Beijing, and with his deep understanding of both the Chinese and US economic systems, he breaks down how China's current model is objectively delivering better results for its citizens. If you really want to understand the decline of US hegemony, the massive AI bubble, the pending stock market crash, and the uncertain future for America, this is the video for you. Let's jump in.
Well, everyone, once again, we're really honored to welcome back into the studio Ben Norton, fantastic journalist, analyst, geopolitical insider. Ben, thank you so much for joining our show again today.
Thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, I really enjoyed your first interview because we talked specifically about Latin America. We focused a lot on Venezuela, the rising tensions that we see between the United States, and really kind of what the United States wants to do in Latin America long term. Definitely seems there's going to be some more conflict and maybe even a tipping point in that region. But I kind of want to focus, this interview a little bit more on the bigger picture things of the United States and kind of its position as global hegemony. We know, for example, the United States government, there's nothing more than it wants to do than maintain its position as the global hegemon. But I think right now we're looking at the United States government as being significantly stretched across the world. Right. We see, for example, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This is a situation where the United States government, Donald Trump has specifically said, look, we need to actually kind of get out of that. And Europe, you're on your own now to really deal with that situation. We see the United States is certainly ramping up tensions with China. We see the conflict in Venezuela. How are you looking at the United States right now in terms of global hegemony and their goal for that? And is the United States too overstretched right now with these conflicts around the world?
Yeah, well, it's clear that U.S. hegemony is in decline. I mean, that's just incontrovertible. If you go back to the 1990s, after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, and then we saw a series of color revolutions. I mean, the U.S. was the only superpower on Earth. It was by far the most powerful country economically as well. And this was known as the unipolar moment. The Washington Post famously talked about the unipolar moment. But of course, the situation today is very different. And I often say that I think there were a few key watershed moments that really brought us into the multipolar era that we're in now. First of all, the most important by far, something that you, Cyrus, have talked about a lot in great detail, the rise of China. Absolutely monumental, absolutely historic. The entire 21st century will entirely revolve around China. The role of China in the global economy is the biggest economy. In 2016, China overtook the US as the largest economy on earth when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. Oftentimes China's GDP is measured at current exchange rates of the yuan to the dollar in dollar terms, which makes China's economy look much smaller because, the yuan is pretty undervalued. If you've been in China, you know how inexpensive everything is. It's very affordable. Right. Well, right. And that makes exports more competitive. Well, when you adjust for purchasing power, China has been larger than the US economy for a decade now, and every year it's growing. Right. So if you look at a chart of China's share of the global economy over time and the US share, they're going in opposite directions. China is becoming more important. China is about 20% of the global economy now and growing. The US is now less than 15% and falling. So that was a monumental shift. And then another part of that, which is deeply related to it, is China becoming the world's factory, the manufacturing superpower. And this has become a huge issue today, right? Because not only Trump, but every US leader, even Biden, tried to reindustrialize the US. This is bipartisan. Right. Biden talked about bringing back industrial policy. Trump says he wants to bring in all these investments to make factories in the US. Unfortunately, I think both Biden obviously failed. I think Trump's also going to fail. We're already seeing that actually, Bloomberg reported that manufacturing jobs are actually falling And a big reason for that is the tariffs, right? Because there's so much uncertainty. Why would you invest in the US? You don't know what the tariff rate's going to be. And a lot of these manufacturers, they need imported goods from China. They need parts. They also need like intermediate goods. So even if you're going to make like some kind of manufactured good in the US, you need all of the other assembled parts that are in that intermediate good that are imported. And the tariffs, you don't know what the tariff rate will be. You can't make any plans. So clearly the US needs to reindustrialize. Everyone admits that. Everyone accepts that. But it's very difficult to do that. Meanwhile, China is just constantly moving up the value chain, becoming the most high-tech manufacturer in certain industries now. Like they're catching up in semiconductors, but they're certainly the world leader in electric vehicles and solar panels. They're making huge progress in nuclear energy. And not only, traditional nuclear energy, but even like salt thorium plants. And there's all these breakthroughs happening. They're talking about nuclear fusion. I mean, it's incredible. You know this as someone who reports on China. I always feel like there's so much to talk about because every week there's another new development. It's incredible. So that's of course. Go ahead.
So Ben, I just wanted to add into that because that's something that we talk specifically a lot about on this channel. But I think it's also really important, Ben, because if you're not studying China and you're not seeing what technology is coming out, you really are being left behind. And I think for example, just this week, the week that we're recording this, China has announced that they're building the world's largest solar farm up in the mountains in Tibet. They've just broken ground on the biggest hydro dam in Tibet as well, which is going to be incredible because that's going to create enough energy that could actually supply the equivalent of the entire United Kingdom. And so you kind of see this, interesting dynamic in China where even, if we contrast between the two, between the United States and China, under Donald Trump, the United States is doubling down on fossil fuels. They're saying fossil fuels is the future. Well, as actually interesting enough, just this week, very quietly, the Trump administration just canceled the largest solar power facility in the United States, actually in my home state of Nevada, where I'm currently recording from. This was actually a solar plant that was actually going to power 2 million homes. And it was actually reported on CNN that very quietly, kind of under the radar, Trump had canceled this. And so you kind of see this interesting dynamic. I wanted to add that to your analysis is, for our viewers out there, that you kind of see the United States and China going down in two different roads. China definitely is doubling down on renewable energy. They're dominant in solar, wind, wind turbines, obviously nuclear power, like you had said, the nuclear fusion reactors. It's actually a really exciting time, I feel, when you're looking at China, because like you said, every single week, there's a new technology that's coming from China that is really going to define the future of our world. And I think that's why it's so important for our viewers out there to be actively listening to podcasts like this so you can understand what is actually going down in the Middle Kingdom in China.
Yeah, well, we could, of course, spend the entire episode talking about this, but I'll just make a brief comment about that.
Sure.
What you said reminded me of, I know later you want to talk about the polarization in the US and how the US is tearing itself apart from the inside, which is also contributing to the decline of US hegemony. These are all related issues.
Correct.
And in the case of Trump, it's so clear. He's just out of spite and also to benefit, big oil corporations. So the current energy secretary in the US is the former CEO of an oil and gas company. So there are economic reasons, but also Trump, he claimed in his UN speech absurdly that like wind power is like a Chinese plot and it doesn't work. He falsely claimed in his UN speech that China sells wind turbines to other countries, but doesn't actually use them, which is false. Actually, China has installed more wind turbines and solar power than the rest of the world combined times two. But getting back to this issue of what Trump is doing, like closing down wind turbines and solar plants just out of spite, he's hurting the US at a time when electricity prices are skyrocketing because these big tech companies are spending literally trillions of dollars they have in the past few years in capital expenditure to build these data centers for AI research. And now we've seen that electricity prices have skyrocketed. The energy grid in the US needs to be massively expanded with everything in order to have more energy, because there's going to be huge shortages of electricity in the upcoming future. Meanwhile, China has so much capacity for electricity. So we see that the grids are just, once again, they show two different paths. And what Trump is really doing is another example of this self-destruction, which is why, as you know, sometimes people in China, they semi-jokingly refer to Trump as 船建国, which is Trump nation builder, right? Which is, it's a kind of this very nationalist, patriotic Chinese name, and it sounds like his, Trumpo, which is Trump. I mean, and they're joking that like Trump is, instead of helping build up the US, he's building up China, making China great again. We'll talk about that later. But getting back to your original question about the decline of US hegemony, these are all factors that are related. So the rise of China is by far the most important factor. There's also the political dysfunction in the US, which is another factor. The rise of Russia is important, not as much as China. You know, Russia's not a major economic power, but it's a major military power. And we've seen that Russia has been able to basically defeat all of NATO combined in Ukraine. Joe Biden claimed that they were going to collapse Russia's economy and that the ruble would become rubble. Well, actually now, the Russian economy is doing much better than all of Western Europe. Russia is the fastest growing economy in Europe, although it's been kicked out of Europe. So it's now, integrating with Eurasia and the BRICS countries. But that's a factor. And then another major factor in the decline of US hegemony is, we talked about the political dysfunction, but it's the economic problems in the US, especially the financial crises. Because, after the US de-industrialized, where did a lot of the so-called growth in the US economy come from? Well, there was real growth in the tech sector, which has become a big bubble, by the way. The S&P 500 is almost completely driven by the Magnificent Seven. And as soon as these big tech companies, as soon as the AI bubble pops, many of them are not really making monies. We see like this circular investment scheme.
Correct.
Where like NVIDIA is investing in OpenAI, which is investing in like an Oracle, and they're investing in like buying chips from buying AI chips from NVIDIA. It's this very circular scheme. But, MIT published a study that found that 95% of AI companies in the US are not making money. So eventually, if that bubble pops, the tech sector is going to see a major crisis, which is also going to probably cause a recession in the US. So that's one area after deindustrialization where the US saw this, ostensible growth. The other area was the financial sector. The US economy has become extremely financialized. If you look at a chart of manufacturing share of GDP in the US, it has been falling since the late 1960s, just continuously, and the financial sector has been growing. And it's the biggest sector in terms of share of GDP. If you look at Bureau of Economic Analysis data, it's the biggest sector in the US economy. It's over 22% of US GDP and growing every year is the financial sector. Well, what they like to call the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate.
Right.
And not construction. Construction is actually building a house people can live in, right? No, real estate. These are existing houses that are being sold that are treated as financial assets, right? And we've seen these big bubbles. I know you also lived in Canada. Canada had they have an even worse housing bubble in terms of percentage of GDP and in terms of percentage of incomes than even the US housing bubble, which was reinflated. This is my point. Like right after the 2007, 2008 housing bubble, after it popped, there was a brief deleverage and they just reinflated the bubble. And they have the AI bubble, they have the everything bubble. So the problem in the US is also related to that. In 2008, the global economy nearly collapsed because of a problem that it initiated in the U.S. financial sector because of, mortgage-backed securities and collateralized debt obligations and all of the fraud that was basically happening with these, ninja loans and these subprime mortgages that were all being, bundled together, and these very risky mortgage-backed securities that were being sold in these MBSs that were given AAA ratings. It was fraud.
Right.
And that brought down the US economy. It brought down many European economies, and the contagion spreaded. One country it didn't bring down was China. Right. China continued to power through that. They had the big infrastructure boom. So that was a major wake-up call. And now we see many countries de-dollarizing. The de-dollarization started in 2008. You look at global central banks holdings, central bank holdings of gold. It's been skyrocketing since 2008. There are now reports that central banks, because gold has increased so much, or another way of saying it, as Luke Gromen often says, it's not so much that gold is increasing, it's that the dollar is falling against gold.
Yeah, exactly.
And now central banks are actually holding more gold than U.S. treasuries for the first time in many decades. So all of these factors have come together to make it very clear that we're seeing the decline of U.S. hegemony, which explains why there's this new Cold War against China, which, you, Cyrus, have talked about very well.
Right. Yeah, Ben, I want to just highlight a couple of things you said there, because there's some really important data points that I think our viewers really need to understand. I think the one thing that you mentioned was the electricity difference. And I'm going to bring up a graph here to really, showcase this, because I think this graph actually is probably the most important graph for everybody to understand for the future. So, basically the United States energy has remained consistent for the last 30 years. I mean, there's been basically the electrical grid is virtually unchanged. So we've had the same amount of energy output in the United States. And of course, we've seen that the needs for electricity, as you've mentioned, with these AI data centers. I mean, these AI data centers, it is an enormous amount of energy needed to fuel the AI revolution. Like what you said, it's all connected, right? Like you said, the stock market right now, about 35 to 40% of the stock market's value is tied up in this Magnificent Seven stocks. Right. Obviously, the poster child of that would be NVIDIA, which has, been an amazing stock. But you kind of wonder, where is this going? Because like you said, the majority of AI companies are not making money in the United States. There's this very big, this circular economy where, basically, I'm going to pay you $1,000. You pay me $1,000. Great. GDP is going up. Great. We're doing all this business, but we're basically just circulating the money around, this AI industry. But, for example, when we look at China, who is making that forward thinking step to say, look, we're going to need more data. Obviously China's building data centers as well. China's certainly developing AI, but the difference is that they're making energy and electricity much more affordable. And they have actually seen a skyrocket in electricity output. And that is, again, because of the solar, the wind, the hydro, and all of these renewable energy sources that, again, this is going to be the future of our world. And if you're not making those investments and you're doubling down on fossil fuels, I mean, honestly, you're just living in the past. I mean, it's remarkable to me that our U.S. politicians don't see that. We certainly see Donald Trump, he just wants to double down. He's eliminated the tax credit, for example, on electric vehicles, making it more expensive. There's always been an incentive in the United States to purchase those vehicles. But as of September 30th, that $7,500 tax credit is now gone, and so, it's certainly the U.S. government, at least under this administration, is certainly moving in the opposite direction of China. And it's just very interesting to notice how these two countries are moving in different ways. But it speaks very much to this main point that we're talking about today, the decline in U.S. hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much we could add here. This is a great conversation, and it's hard to know which direction to go in. And just a few thoughts on the Magnificent Seven. This is a crazy bubble, and it's so much of a bubble that top corporate executives have admitted it's a bubble, and then people just keep investing and they just keep driving. It's just all momentum. It's not fundamentals at all. NVIDIA's their PE ratio, price to earnings ratio, is over 50, which is crazy. I mean, NVIDIA obviously is a very important company, probably right now the most important company in the world. That's why they're like, $4 trillion market cap. It's crazy. Correct. But they overtook Apple. But that's just that's not rational. Over 50 times PE ratio. And then Tesla has always been crazy in La La Land. It's like, it was over 100. It's like now over 200 PE ratio. That's just because of Elon Musk. Anyway, but it's not, I mean, this is a bubble. Even Sam Altman admitted, the CEO of OpenAI, who, right after Trump's inauguration, he was, hours later, he was invited to the White House and Trump announced this Project Stargate and $500 billion of investment. I mean, so clearly, like, the White House, this is true under Biden too, but especially now, they're like really pushing this bubble forward in really dangerous ways that are going to cause catastrophic consequences. Meanwhile, Sam Altman admitted recently it's a bubble, but he said, bubbles can sometimes be good because, like the dot-com bubble, we got the internet. But meanwhile, I mean, you could have still had the internet. You could have had fiber optic technology without the insane speculative mania on the bubble. In fact, the technology may have been adopted more safely and more effectively without the bubble, whatever. I mean, obviously AI, I'm not saying like AI is not important. I'm not like AI is going to be important. It's going to be revolutionary. But these people are obviously high on their own supply. They think they're going to have AGI in 1 year, and we're going to merge with the computer in 5, whatever. Like it's a crazy bubble. Even Jeff Bezos also admitted it's a bubble, and he said the same thing. Bubbles can be good. I mean, we're in a bubble that makes the dot-com bubble look like child's play. And in terms of, the famous Buffett indicator, which is, the market capitalization of all publicly traded companies as a percentage of GDP, it's over 200%, which is the highest it's ever been in US history. So it's crazy. One other quick point that's related to this on electricity. We talked about China. Another major issue in China that's often should be kept in mind. One of the reasons that electricity in China is so cheap is it's a state-owned grid. They're not trying to profit. They're not owned by private equity. Traditionally, BlackRock was a more traditional asset manager, but now BlackRock's also getting into private equity, like Blackstone. People confuse them. Blackstone has traditionally been the alternative asset manager. They have a big private equity arm. BlackRock is now also getting into private equity through their global infrastructure buy-up. And BlackRock is now buying up the electrical grid in multiple parts of the US, like Minnesota recently. And it's obvious they're just going to ratchet up the cost of electricity. Instead of building out, we need more electricity. They're buying up the existing electrical grid and they're going to significantly raise prices. Meanwhile, in China, they're building it out at breakneck speed. And because it's a state-owned company, they're not concerned about profit. They obviously don't want to operate at a loss, but they're just building out everything as fast as they can because they understand that this is an infrastructure. This is a public good that private companies will use. And yeah, they can use it for their own research and development and industry, but they're not trying to maximize profit and rent seeking in the electrical grid. And furthermore, in terms of, we talked about renewables, which obviously I think are very important. They're the future. Electrification is very important. It's also good for China from an energy security perspective, because China relies a lot on importing oil that goes from, like, for instance, through choke points like the Strait of Malacca. That comes from the Gulf. And also it goes through the Strait of Hormuz. And we see that with the US and Israeli war on Iran, there were fears they could close the Strait of Hormuz. So China wants to make sure it has more energy security by having all of that more and more electricity produced at home. But I want to briefly talk about nuclear, which is not talked about enough.
Right.
I mean, the nuclear build out right now in China is crazy. China right now, it's like, I think, the number 3 nuclear energy producer. I mean, the US had a huge nuclear energy build out and they have not caught up. The infrastructure in the US is very behind.
Right.
And because it's so expensive in the US, and also, by the way, because fossil fuel companies in the US have lobbied a lot against nuclear energy because it's the main competitor, and have spread a lot of anti-nuclear propaganda. Anti-nuclear energy propaganda. Nuclear is the safest and also the greenest form of energy. And objectively, fossil fuel is much more deadly. Literally every single year, there are hundreds of thousands of people, if not, some studies say millions of people, who die every year around the world due to health-related issues caused by, pollution from coal and oil and gas, especially coal. But anyway, getting back to nuclear, China right now is going through the biggest nuclear energy build up ever in history. They're currently building over 25 nuclear energy plants, and they have plans to build over 100. Yeah. And like I said, it's not just like the traditional technology. They're making so much progress every few years on new, more experimental forms of energy, nuclear energy, like these thorium salt reactors. Right. And reportedly in Inner Mongolia, they have so much thorium that they can, which is not nearly as radioactive as like uranium and plutonium, they can basically have power for thousands of years. This clean, zero emissions, green energy. So, I mean, China is literally the future. Like not only in the sense of like what we see now, but imagine what they're going to be doing 20 years from now. If right now they're already leading in these sectors. I mean, it makes me very hopeful. And of course, the US could have that potential, but all of the incentives are not aligned. Economy is structured in a way that you have all these big companies that are just rent seeking. They don't want competition. They don't want to innovate. And it's why electricity prices are going through the roof. And unfortunately, electricity is going to become more and more expensive in the US. Like people are saying, it's going to be like housing. Like instead of building out lots of affordable housing has become a speculative asset. And China dealt with that issue. As President Xi famously said, houses are for living in, not for speculation. Correct. Well, in the US, houses are for speculation, and now electricity is going to become for speculation as well.
Yeah, it's wild. Ben, I want to kind of parlay this into a little bit more domestic analysis right now. And I want to talk specifically about the United States. I mean, we look at, I think this is an interesting topic for us to discuss because you and I are both US citizens. We've spent a lot of time in the US. I mean, where I'm very worried about the United States in the future because I see a tremendous amount of polarization. I see a lot of division. I see a lot of poverty. I see a lot of people that have lost hope. How are you looking at it specifically from a domestic issue? As we're looking at, certainly Donald Trump has made a very bold move this year of starting a trade war with literally every single country in the world. This has not resulted in a positive outcome for the United States. For example, the stated goal of making America great again. I fail to see, where the United States is improving. I think unfortunately, we have a worse relationship with some of our closest allies as a result of this tariff war. I think we see the United States is not trusted by as many countries around the world. We're seeing the dollar has had its worst year since it's gotten off the gold standard, down over 13% so far. We've seen that correlated exactly with gold. Like you had said, it's over $4,200, smashing. I mean, every single week. It's hard to actually keep up with the price of gold because it's been rising so fast. Where do you see this going? Where do you see this going specifically for U.S. citizens and for the future of the United States?
Well, again, I hate to be pessimistic, but I have to be realistic. I have to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't see it going well. I see it getting worse, unfortunately. And you're right. I mean, there are so many problems in the U.S. that could be solved, but they're not being solved. First of all, the homelessness. Now, I haven't lived full time in the U.S. since 2018. Every time I've only gone back 2 times since then, but every time I've been back, it has been shocking the level of homelessness, and especially when you're in China, but not just in China, by the way. I mean, China has basically no homelessness. I've been here over 2 years and I've never seen a homeless person, and I've traveled around.
Right.
But it's not just China. I mean, people act like as though it's like a uniquely China thing. Like even in many other parts of Asia and some parts of Europe, you also don't see homeless people.
Right.
It's a huge issue in the US. And it gets worse every time I go back and every year. And objectively speaking, the data, which is always a conservative, underestimate, the data gets worse every year. So that the poverty, we talked about how, housing is completely unaffordable, which is why there's so much homelessness, but also electricity is now becoming more everything, healthcare, education, and it's just so expensive to live in the US. And wages have been pretty stagnant really since the 1970s. I mean, there's been a little fluctuation, but real wages have been pretty stagnant. And certainly they've not kept up with productivity gains. And even productivity gains recently have slowed down a lot. People say, well, with AI, there will be more productivity gains. That's probably true, but there will also be more unemployment and underemployment, this is something that really concerns me. And that's actually why there's been a lot of debate about low fertility rates.
Right.
And obviously there are a lot of economic problems that come from that, especially for paying for social programs when you have more and more elderly people on Medicare. Like obviously with lower fertility rates, that is an issue. But I think actually a bigger issue is underemployment and unemployment. We're already seeing a lot of people coming out of college. They can't find jobs. Youth unemployment is a big problem. It's also a problem in China. They're trying to solve it, right? And especially with all of these white collar jobs that are being automated, and they're not being completely eliminated, but instead of a company hiring 10 software engineers, they might only hire 2, right?
Right.
So we're going to see lots of underemployment. These are going to be big issues that are going to cause so many problems in the US. And I think China is actually in a much better place to solve these issues because the government is so powerful and because it has a socialist oriented economy that can say, okay, fine, like the state is going to do something. They're going to provide a job. They're going to provide a job guarantee, whatever. Like in the US, I don't see any political will for that, which is why instead I think a job guarantee is a much better proposal than universal basic income. But we've seen that Sam Altman actually has been funding a lot of research on UBI, universal basic income. Elon Musk has been floating this. I think this is a catastrophic idea because basically what they're going to say is that millions of people are going to be unemployed and they're going to be paid like $1,000 a month of a check to just have enough money to survive, to not have any productive life, to not be part of a community. That is crazy. But that's what these big tech companies want because they need these people to be on their platforms. That's how they make money. But people can't be on the platforms if they can't survive. So like, unfortunately, this isn't even talking about the political polarization. Just economically, like what is the vision for the future of the US economy? Like, I mean, sadly, like there are all these stupid conspiracies about the World Economic Forum, but it is true that like the World Economic Forum is like this, they're just controlled by these big corporate monopolies, these new oligarchs. And but it's true that the World Economic Forum had this famous slogan that you'll own nothing and be happy. And some people claim like this is socialism. No, it's the opposite. It's like corporate feudalism. Like that's the vision of all these big tech companies is they own everything. Elon Musk becomes a trillionaire. No one has a job and they all pay rent in order to use, you pay rent to use Netflix. You pay rent to use your toothbrush. You pay rent to use your car. Like, and they're now having these things like, I saw this crazy report recently how all of these US car companies are now in order to get in order to repair your car and get a part, you can't go to like a local mom and pop repair shop because all of the software is designed in a way that only the actual manufacturer, like only Ford or GM, only their certified repair shops will allow you to fix your car. And
Right.
John Deere is doing this with tractors. I mean, like, this is crazy. Like, it's all just monopolies. It's all rent seeking. And then for me, that's the reason that there is so much political polarization. If you actually had a government that cared about working class people, that provided like an actual standard of living that was high, where people could afford, not only afford housing, but afford to have kids. We ask why birth rates are so low. They're so low because no one can afford to live in places where all the jobs are. If you want a good job, you have to live in a big city. If you want to live in a big city, you have to find housing. Housing is insanely expensive. How are you going to raise kids in a small apartment? I mean, all these issues are related together. But what we've seen is that under both parties, it's a complete oligarchy. I mean, like, obviously, with Trump, it's just he's taking the mask off. But it was true under Biden. It was true under Obama. Obama bailed out Wall Street. Not a single banker went to jail after committing fraud. And then in the case of Trump, I mean, he invites all of these big tech oligarchs to his inauguration. They sit with his cabinet members. I mean, I unfortunately, I'm really pessimistic about the situation. And there needs to be fundamental, radical change, like transformative change. And the irony is that I think China actually has a much more effective system. I think you probably agree with me, but there's this very, the last thing I'll say here is that there's a very cynical, I think very condescending talking point that we've heard repeated again and again and again. People say, Marco Rubio said this, we thought that China would become more like us, but we became more like China. Well, I would say you should become more like China, like in a lot of ways, because objectively speaking, the standard of living in China is higher, especially in a lot of the tier 1 cities, the tier 2 cities. Or if you look at all the data, the Human Development Index is getting better, per capita income is getting better in China, whereas it's not in the US.
Yeah, I'll add a couple things onto that. I think the first data point that we want to talk about is you had mentioned, this difference in the political systems, and I think there's a very common theme in China that a rising tide should lift all boats, and I think that really is the fundamental of the socialist, government that China has. But I want to be honest, it's a socialism with capitalism, right? I mean, China certainly does
with
embrace
a market economy, a very vibrant market. I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'll just add this quick note on this.
Sure.
I've kind of mentioned this. Like, this is related to the monopolies in the US. Monopolies don't want competition because it drives down profit margins. In order to have the highest possible profits, you want a monopoly, which is what I was talking about, the corporate monopolies in Silicon Valley. This is literally the business model of Silicon Valley. This is what Peter Thiel, one of Trump's close allies, admitted in an article he published in the Wall Street Journal. It was titled, "Competition is for Losers," and he argued in defense of monopolies. Meanwhile, look at China. They have the exact opposite. This is why profit margins are razor thin. Many companies are not making any money because there's so much competition, because the Chinese government makes sure there are no monopolies. If there is a monopoly, it's state-owned. So the natural monopolies like telecommunications and infrastructure and energy and finance, those are state-owned. But then in the actual areas where they want innovation and they want actual technological development, like EVs, it's just a free-for-all of competition.
Yeah, and I think that's the difference as well. When you look at these, for example, we talked about the electrical grid and how that this has been, a very big profit center, right? I mean, we see electricity costs are skyrocketing, along with every other cost in the United States for that matter. But it's the same thing where China has that principle that, we need to look out for society. So I think when you're looking at, for example, your basic cost, whether it is electricity or healthcare, even things like internet now, right? Like that is something that the Chinese government says, look, we need to make sure that the internet is available to everybody and that it's cheap and affordable, because now in 2025, having access to cheap, reliable internet is, kind of a basic human right now. I mean, like you need to, in order to function in this advanced society, you've got to have access to the internet. So, they make sure that, again, the entire nation is 5G network, and it's in an extremely high 5G. China's already working on 6G technology. But essentially, you can get a smartphone for a very affordable price in China. You can have lightning fast internet at all times, for a very affordable price, much, much cheaper than you can in the United States. And it runs significantly faster and better than you have in the United States, because that is, again, the government prioritizing that. We see this often, Ben, it's quite interesting, is this difference between, Western media and how they portray China. For example, I know for a long time, Western media criticized China for building the high-speed rail network. And I remember reading an article for one saying, I can't believe, China has invested billions of dollars in this high-speed rail. There's never going to be a chance they could ever break even or even start to make money on this. This has been a huge loss. But then you start looking at, I go back to the United States when, our president, I believe it was Eisenhower, who said, we need to, for example, make the interstate system, right? We need to build roads in the United States. Now, obviously, to build all of these great interstates that we have in America, there was a cost to that, right? Interstates are free, by the way. We don't actually, it's not a toll road. All interstates in America are free. So, there's a cost there, that the United States government, certainly bore, but that is a benefit to society. And obviously the interstate system has benefited American society for a long time. Interesting enough, just last year, there was an SCMP article that came out that actually the China rail system started to make a profit on many of its lines. And it actually, again, it's used so heavily in China because that has revolutionized trade. It's revolutionized, quality of life. But even thinking about, getting from a big tier city like a Shanghai or Beijing, we know that there's many migrant workers that live in small rural villages. I mean, Ben, I was in China in 2007, where I remember my colleagues would say that, it's going to take me 45 hours to get to my hometown because I have to take 5 different trains and then 3 different buses in order to get back there. That same colleague now, it's like, well, now I can go home in 5 hours. You've seen this kind of transformation because now it's one high-speed train and then one local bus to my village. And that village is, by the way, been upgraded. And, it's we have paved roads, we have all of these infrastructure. And I think that's what you really need to look at in society. And I think this is what we're seeing a lot in the youth in America, that are becoming increasingly frustrated at actually what they're seeing in China. For example, the world's largest bridge opened up a couple weeks in China. This was huge across social media. Even in America, many people are saying, wow, China built this, the world's largest bridge in this remote area of the country. They did it in 48 months with a budget of $300 million. And, very famously, the Baltimore Bridge that collapsed. Here we are 18 months later, and they just drove the first pylon into the ground, to start rebuilding that project. God knows how long that's going to take in order for the United States to complete that bridge. But good luck. I mean, that's going to be, multiple years before that project's done. Where again, we see China saying, look, the people need this, right? We need this bridge. It's going to get done. Let's prioritize this. Let's get this done. And so I think you just see a very interesting shift that I find is personally happening, and certainly what's happening online. More and more people are discovering China. More people are discovering, what's actually happening in the country. And I think, especially in the youth of America, I think people are looking at China in a much more positive light, certainly than the older generation. And I think something's going to have to change here, for the United States. I don't know how. I don't know when. I mean, it might have to be after this bubble pops and, another economic recession comes to the United States. But it is certainly a very interesting time to be observing, the role of the United States and the decline of U.S. hegemony.
Yeah, there's so much we could talk about. I have a few thoughts based on what you said there.
Yeah.
I mentioned that the U.S. could learn a lot from China. Well, it reminded me. One time I read an article by an economist at Renmin University, which is, for people who don't know, a top Chinese university, and he drew a very interesting historical parallel between pre-Qing era China and pre-revolutionary China and the Tang dynasty. So for people who don't know, the Tang dynasty, it's known in China as like one of the most prosperous dynasties. It was like the peak of Chinese civilization. It was economically very well developed and culturally very well developed. And this Chinese economist argued that the reason for the decline of the Tang dynasty was that originally you had a Tang leader who had land reform, and the peasants were given land, and he broke up all the landlords and their monopolies, and there was a lot of equality, and there were more opportunities, and there was a very meritocratic system, meritocracy. But over time, the landlords consolidated more control, and it became more and more of an oligarchy. It became less and less of a meritocracy. And basically, this economist argued that throughout Chinese history, there was this kind of back and forth where you have this enlightened leader who comes to power, like in the Tang dynasty, who has progressive reforms, land reform. They break up the monopolies in the land. They break up the landlords. And basically, he argued that this is what happened in China. You had the kind of excesses of the Mao era, but you did have land reform and investment in education, healthcare, and then you have the reform and opening up. And So he's kind of drawing parallels throughout Chinese history to today. I mean, it's so similar to the US.
Right.
Like the US did have this kind of golden era after World War II. The US was the world's leading economic power. There was a lot of relative equality. Taxes on the rich were very high, but it's not like there was complete equality, 100% equality. But there was much more equality, but there were higher standards of living, very strong social services, good education and healthcare. You didn't have to spend $50,000 to go to the emergency room for 2 days or whatever, which is now common.
Correct.
The most common form of bankruptcy in the US is medical bills. And so in the US, you had this era. And then what happened is that the oligarchy there's complete deregulation starting. I mean, it's not all Reagan's fault. This was continued after Reagan. Bill Clinton, in fact, even went further than Reagan did in deregulating Wall Street, and basically what we've seen, it just becomes so obvious. The US is a complete oligarchy. Yeah. And these oligarchs, as Peter Thiel said, they don't want competition. They don't want innovation in certain sectors. So housing has become it's a speculative asset. It's not for living in, it's for buying up. Blackstone is the largest owner of real estate, the largest landlord in the US. But it's not just, sometimes people try to distract from that and they say, well, they say that actual investment firms are only a small percentage of the overall owners of US residential real estate. But it's not just the big, professional asset managers and investors. It's also just everyone in general. Right. It's so common. If you have savings, what do? You want to buy a house because it's your nest egg. That's like an investment that you make, not as a place to live. It's just everything has become financialized. There are fewer and fewer good job opportunities. And for me, the big issue is look at China's incentive structure, look at the US incentive structure. If you get a PhD in physics in the US, what do? You go work in finance. You become a quant. This is so common. There are so many stories about these guys who get PhDs and gals who get PhDs in math and engineering and whatever, and they go in computer science and they go work at a hedge fund. Whereas in China, they're cracking down on that and they're saying, no, go make some kind of new technology, go found some startup and make whatever. And then the government also, what's incredible about China is they even have state venture capital funds, state venture capitalists who are the socialist venture capitalists who are the government is giving money to make these. They're saying look, we want to develop this technology and the US has so much potential and there are so many brilliant people, but they all go work on Wall Street. And then what's even worse about this is how it infects all of society. So now everyone is a retail investor and they're all losing money on derivatives. Everyone has on their phone, it's just everyone's addicted to gambling. This is just gambling. And then sports gambling was made legal. I recently read in the Financial Times that now if you take every man, woman, and child in the US and you just look at sports gambling, that the amount of money lost in sports gambling, it's several $1,000s for every man, woman, and child in the US. And then Robinhood is you have it on your phone, you can just lose money on derivatives. It's crazy. For me, this is this is an oligarchy that is destroying society. And for me, the political dysfunction is a reflection of that. And until we can get money out of politics, which is, Citizens United, the infinite money, over 80% of senators running for office with more funding win the election. Over 90% of House representatives with more funding win the election. Until we can solve that issue, for me, there's no way of solving this issue. China has been able to solve that. And I think that's why, again, we should learn from what China's doing.
Yeah, Ben, I think that's a great way to kind of finish this episode and discuss that. Ben, I just want to thank you so much for your insights. I know that I have learned a lot. I just love your knowledge, your in-depth analysis. I think our viewers here definitely enjoyed this. And Ben, it's been so nice to finally connect. I know that we've been talking about doing this podcast for a long time. I'm so glad the stars could align and, continue your great success on YouTube and your geopolitical economy report. I absolutely love it. I love watching your episodes. I love, the work that you're doing. And I look forward to seeing you in Beijing. Let's definitely meet up next summer when I'm back. And look forward to recording some more content with you.
Yeah, or I'll go down and meet you in Guangzhou. That would be fun.
Oh, yeah. Down to Guangzhou. 欢迎. Come down anytime, my friend. All right. All right, everybody. Well, everybody, I'm going to drop the links down to Ben's podcast and make sure that you follow him on YouTube and also follow his geopolitical economy report. We're going to put all those links down in the description. And as always, thank you all for spending time with us here today on YouTube, and look forward to seeing you all in our next episode soon.
Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed today's interview with Ben Norton. We're currently living in a period of rapid change with major reshuffling of power between the global north and global south. Today's video really highlights how much of this decline is tied to the rise of the oligarchy and the concentration of power across Western democracies, as well as how China's development model has managed to avoid the West's failures. The global geopolitical landscape is shifting every day, so it's more important than ever to stay informed. Make sure you subscribe to the channel to keep up to date in today's chaotic climate, and if you like Ben's insights, you can find links to his work down in the description below. As always, I want to thank you all for your incredible support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next episode soon.